With the delayed budget speech set to be delivered this week by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, the minister told media that a VAT hike is a necessary indicator, or at least a necessary tax instrument to fund the SRD grant. The SRD grant comes at a cost of more than 35 billion rand. The ANC's coalition partners collectively rejected the February budget because of the proposed VAT hike of 2 percentage points. For more on this, we now speak to political economist Dr. Dale McKinley. Dr. McKinley, if the ANC and its coalition partners can't find each other on tax instrument movements and the upward adjustments thereof, the hard decision of letting go of the SRD grant will have to be made. But given that there has been a promise of the SRD grant to be continued into 2026 by the President in the State of the Nation address, it now has to be funded. One way or the other, the money has to be found for this. And there's very little fiscal instruments available to find this money. Do you think a compromise will be made on the VAT question, that it may not be 2%, but somewhere between 0 and 2%, the DA and other coalition partners might want to be willing to make a compromise towards? Do you see that happening?
Well, first, hi, Oliver, and thank you for having me. Listen, I think, first of all, there's going to have to be a compromise, but I want to contest this notion, because what we're framing this debate as if there's no other alternative. The VAT is the only tax that can be basically, it's the question of how much it's going to be, whether it's going to be 2 or 1 or so forth. And I think that that's probably going to happen. I think that there probably is going to be a VAT tax rate, probably maybe even 0.5% or less than 1% as a compromise in the GNU. But I think the larger question here is, which is not, we're really not talking about much in the media because it's being framed, is the other instruments, as you mentioned. There are other instruments. There are other tax instruments that can be used. The problem is that this government is not willing to politically and ideologically consider those because it's business friendly. And it doesn't want to go after those with wealth. It doesn't want to go after the 1%ers, the 2%ers. And it doesn't want to go after the corporations. And when you choose not to do that, then you're left with few options. And we're in a situation where VAT, which is the most unfavorable tax for the majority of the population, is now being considered as the only tax. And that's the problem, I think, here. But I do think there will be a compromise because the GNU is not willing to bite the political bullet that's necessary to raise the funds from elsewhere.
South Africa already has, compared to other OECD countries and emerging markets, one of the highest corporate income tax rates in the world at 28%. It was lowered from 29% during the commodities boom of 2022-2023. We're now well past that commodities boom that started in around 2021. And the argument has always been that if you tax businesses more, they have no incentive to domicile their businesses here. More importantly, that the Laffer curve suggests that a higher tax rate for businesses means lower returns ultimately that will be taking place. Do you think that those positions are stated as untested truths and that perhaps needs a reconsideration, at least an economic reconsideration based on the fundamentals that underpin it?
Absolutely, and here's why I can tell you that that's the case, Oliver. In 2002, a time when we now celebrate as growth, the economy was growing at 3 to 4, 5%. We had a good government. Guess what the corporate tax rate in South Africa was in 2002? It was 37.8%. 37.8%, a full 10% more than it is today. And what we're now saying is we can't even consider a 1% raise, because this will scare off investment in business. I would say absolute nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. It basically is a situation where we are not, we have an ideological sort of consensus, it would seem, in not only in South Africa, but across the globe, where the wealthy are not to be touched because this mantra that if you do this, then they'll disinvest or they'll go elsewhere and other kinds of things. South Africa's got a lot of business going. It's not going to make a huge bit of difference to most corporations whether they pay another 1 or 1.5%. There's also others which we haven't even talked about besides the corporate tax rate, about some of the incentives in businesses around capital gains tax, around a tax on the JSE, which has been floated many years ago. These kinds of things need to be brought back onto the agenda, because if we don't bring them back onto the agenda, then what is the option? The option is to go for the majority of the population and squeeze them even further. That's not a solution. To pay, you're basically robbing Peter to pay Peter. Essentially is what you're doing. Essentially, that's what the GNU is saying. We're going to tax you more in order to give a grant. and tax ordinary people, but we're going to leave the wealthy alone because we don't want to scare them away. And I think this is a problem.
Dr. McKinley, so let's then talk about the comparatives of the different tax instruments, because if you increase corporate income tax by 1% or even 2% at most, you're collecting 24, maybe 25 billion rand additionally. What is needed to cover the shortfall is 58 billion, which is what a 2 percentage point increase in VAT will give you. VAT is a lot more widespreading and far-reaching a tax instrument than any of the others. And so it's an easier collection-based instrument compared to corporate income tax, which doesn't cover all of the shortfall. How then do they balance the different tax instruments against each other to cover their shortfall?
Well, the first thing is, I mean, again, we're keeping the conversation as if 1% is the maximum we can go, when I just indicated that 15, 20 years ago it was 10% greater. So that's the first thing. We need to have a debate about that and what would be possible. But beyond the corporate tax rate, there are tax breaks for high-income earners that are linked to pensions and medical aid contributions, massive billions and billions in tax breaks that are being given. These could also be looked at. There's also corporate tax breaks such as employment tax incentives. Now, those make sense if we're growing the economy and if people are being employed, but not just basically giving money away for people not to create jobs. Then there's also regarding high interest rate, high worth rate individuals, highest earners, in terms of their tax bracket through levying, for example, a progressive social security tax that could fund the BIG or could fund an increase. There are many other financing mechanisms that can be used and that can be considered. The bottom line is, Oliver, we're not even considering these things. So we're having a conversation within a very narrow framework, and we're saying, if that's only the framework, well, then of course it makes sense that you're going to increase VAT. But if we look at these others, which might be politically unpalatable to some sections of our population, but not to the majority, then we're talking serious economics. Because if we're going to pay attention to the people who actually put the political parties into power, which is the majority of the middle class and the working class, then those are the people that must be listened to, not simply those that have money. If we're going to learn anything from what's happening in the United States right now, is that if you only listen to the wealthy, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah. Dr. McKinley, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Really do appreciate it. Dr. Dale McKinley is a political economist.